The horn sounds before the sun rises. It carries no signal of imminent attack. No enemy has been spotted along the river. No intelligence has arrived in the night. It is simply the cornu, the curved bronze watch horn, sounding across a Roman frontier fort on the Rhine, somewhere around the year 100 AD. And at the sound of it, 800 soldiers begin to move. In rooms they share with 7 other men, legionaries pull on wool tunics in the darkness. They lace the straps of their armor, the iron segments stiff in the cold air that comes off the river. They step out of long barracks buildings into a courtyard that smells of wood smoke from bakery furnaces burning since the 3rd watch of the night, and of bread almost ready, and of horses in the stable block at the far end of the compound. The Rhine is somewhere to the north, invisible through the pre-dawn dark. There is no enemy visible in any direction. There has not been a significant engagement on this stretch of the frontier in years. The men moving through the grey morning are not going to war today. They are going to roll call. And if you have watched history about the Roman army before, which there is a fair chance you have, what you are about to see is not the version of the story that most history gives you. The famous battles fill the documentaries. Alesia, the siege of Jerusalem, the campaigns in Dacia. You know what Roman legions were capable of when pointed at an enemy. You have seen the formations, the engineering, the relentless tactical intelligence of Roman warfare at its peak. What almost no one tells you is what happened between those moments. A Roman soldier served for 20 to 25 years. The battles that fill the history books occupied a fraction of that time. A few months in a serious campaign year, if a man was stationed somewhere that saw active fighting. On a quiet frontier posting, and most postings were quiet, most of the time genuine combat was a rarity. Some soldiers completed their entire service without fighting a significant engagement. What filled the other years is the subject of this video. And the argument you are about to spend an hour with is this: those other years are not the gap before the real history. The discipline, the labor, the financial structures, the social world of the Roman military between its wars, these are the actual engine of Roman power. The battles were the test. This was the machine that built the thing being tested. To understand how that machine was constructed, you need to go back to a decision made in 107 BC, when a Roman general named Gaius Marius did something that would change the nature of military power for generations. Before Marius, the Roman army was built on property. To serve in the legions, a Roman man needed to own enough land and goods to equip himself for campaign and to justify his civic stake in Rome's survival. This system had its logic. Men who owned farms and businesses had something concrete to defend and something concrete to lose. It tied military service to civic identity in a way that made intuitive sense for a city-state fighting seasonal wars close to home. It had a hard limit. As Rome's wars grew longer and farther away, the men with property to lose were precisely the men who could not leave for extended periods. Farms did not run themselves. When the Juguthine War in North Africa and the simultaneous threat of migrating northern peoples, the Cimbri and the Teutones, pressing toward Italy, stretched Roman manpower past what the property-based system could supply, the structure cracked. Marius opened the legions to the capite censi men, counted only by head in the Roman census because they owned nothing worth taxing. These men had no farms waiting for them between campaigns. They needed the army to provide their equipment, which it now did. They needed the army to provide their future, which meant they needed their general to provide it, since only a politically powerful commander could deliver the land grants and pensions that these men's service required. The result was an army of extraordinary military effectiveness. It was also the structural origin of the civil wars that followed, because soldiers who depend on their general for their future do not give their loyalty to an abstract state. They give it to the man. When Sulla needed his legions to march on Rome in 88 BC, they marched. When Caesar needed his men to cross the Rubicon in 49 BC, they crossed. When Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between their competing forces, soldiers chose sides based on personal loyalty, personal calculation and personal interest, not on anything resembling constitutional principle. Marius had not intended any of this. He solved an immediate military crisis and generated a structural one that would take 8 decades and several rounds of catastrophic civil war to resolve. Augustus resolved it. After defeating Mark Antony at Actium in 31 BC and establishing himself as the first Roman emperor, Octavian, now Augustus, understood the problem with complete clarity. He had an enormous, battle-hardened army whose loyalty ran to individuals. His task was to redirect that loyalty toward the institution itself, toward the system, toward Rome as a legal and financial entity that would outlast any individual general. He did this with remarkable bureaucratic precision. Fixed service terms were established and actually honored. Pay was regularized and delivered in predictable installments 3 times per year under the Augustan arrangement, on or around the 1st of January, May, and September. In 6 AD, Augustus created the Aerarium Militar, a dedicated military treasury funded by a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% auction tax on public sales. He contributed approximately 42.5 million denarii of his own personal wealth as startup capital. From this treasury came the discharge bonuses that anchored everything. 3,000 denarii for a legionary upon honorable completion of service. Approximately 12 to 13 years of gross pay delivered in one payment at the end of 20 years. The state was making a financial promise to every man who enlisted and creating a dedicated institution to ensure the promise was kept. Think carefully about what this accomplished. A soldier's primary allegiance was no longer to a general who might die in next year's campaign. It was to the system that held his financial future. The man with 5 years remaining before his discharge bonus was not going to betray the institution that controlled everything he had spent 15 years building toward. His retirement was in that treasury. His citizenship for the auxiliary soldiers recruited from non-Roman populations across the provinces was written on the discharge diploma the system would eventually hand him. By the early 2nd century AD, roughly 28 to 30 legions were distributed across the empire's frontiers, on the Rhine, on the Danube, in Britain, Syria, Egypt, North Africa. Most of these legions were stationed in permanent fortresses with no active campaign planned and no significant enemy immediately threatening. The men inside had signed away 20 years of their lives to this institution. So what, exactly, did they do with those years? The answer begins not with a weapon but with the sound of a pen on wood. Among the most remarkable objects ever recovered from a Roman military site are a collection of thin wooden writing tablets, sheets of birch, alder, or oak, roughly the size of a modern postcard, found buried in the waterlogged soil at a fort called Vindolanda, just south of what would become Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. They date primarily to around 92 to 105 AD. Written in ink in a distinctive cursive hand, they are the daily administrative correspondence of a frontier garrison. Duty rosters, strength reports, supply requests, personal letters, shopping lists, the accumulated paperwork of ordinary military life on the edge of the known world. One of these tablets is a formal strength report. It records a notional garrison strength of 752 soldiers. It then records how many were actually present and available for duty that day, 296, barely 40% of the theoretical unit. The rest were sick, on authorized leave, detached to other postings, serving as escorts, working on road maintenance 2 provinces over, or absent for any number of carefully tracked administrative reasons. No battle had happened. No epidemic had swept through. This was a normal day at a normal fort, and the gap between what the paperwork said a unit should be and what it actually was at any given moment is one of the most important facts about how the Roman army actually functioned, a fact the famous battle narratives never capture. For the soldiers who were present that day, the morning had been planned before any of them woke. The tesserarius, the officer responsible for the daily watchword, had already distributed the tessera, the small token bearing the day's password. Without it, no one moved through the fort's gates unchallenged. Each century had its assignments, written out and accounted for. Guard rotation at the main gate and the commander's quarters, construction detail on the drainage system, being extended on the fort's western side, training in the open ground north of the walls, escort for the supply convoy expected from the south, and the fatigue duties, which surviving papyri from other sites confirm included, assigned by name on a rotating schedule, maintenance of the fort's latrines. This is what Roman military discipline meant in peacetime, not primarily flogging and dramatic punishments. Those existed, and we will get to them. It meant, first and most fundamentally, that every hour of every day was assigned, recorded, accounted for, and reviewed. The machine ran at the same steady pace, regardless of whether a campaign was approaching or 3 years away. That consistency was not accidental. It was the point. Roman military doctrine described in the most detail by a late 4th century writer named Vegetius, who drew on earlier sources and who must be read carefully as a retrospective account rather than an eyewitness, held that discipline and daily training were the foundation of military effectiveness, more important than numbers or even courage. The caution about Vegetius matters. He was writing in a period when he believed the Roman army had declined, and he was partly describing an idealized past. But the general picture he presents is consistent with what archaeology and other sources confirm. Roman soldiers trained under weight. They marched, ran, swam, jumped. They practiced weapons drill with training swords and shields reportedly heavier than the real equipment, a deliberate hardening technique that made the actual weapons feel lighter under combat conditions. On a quiet frontier posting, the men trained to this standard might never need it. The fitness built across hundreds of ordinary mornings, the formation responses drilled into muscle memory over years, all of it might be called upon for a campaign that never arrived. They trained anyway. Because an army that prepares for war only when war is imminent is not a professional force. It is an expensive militia. And Rome had learned, at considerable historical cost, the difference. The centurion made most of this happen. He is the figure who, more than any famous general, defined the daily experience of being a Roman soldier. Not the commanders whose names appear in histories, but this man typically promoted from the ranks after years of demonstrated competence, commanding 80 soldiers through an authority symbolized and exercised by a vine staff about 3 feet long. The vine staff was called the vitis. Dense, flexible, made from grapevine wood, it was the centurion's mark of office and his most immediate disciplinary instrument. A soldier who fell out of step during formation drill might feel it across his back before he had time to correct himself. A man who appeared at morning inspection with poorly maintained equipment might receive a strike before the centurion had finished looking him over. The correction was immediate, physical, and public. Everyone in the century witnessed it. That was precisely the point. Most centurions were men who had risen through exactly this system. They had been the soldiers on the receiving end of it. They had internalized its logic, endured its pressures, and earned their position by being what the institution required. Many were genuinely skilled military professionals who understood that the standards they enforced were not arbitrary cruelty, but the maintenance of behaviors that, in actual combat, determined whether a unit held or broke. Some exceeded these bounds considerably. Tacitus records a centurion who served on the Rhine frontier during the 1st century AD. His soldiers had given him a nickname that tells you everything about how he ran his century. They called him Sedo Alteram. In Latin, bring me another, because this centurion, his formal name was Lucilius, broke vine staffs across his men's backs so frequently that he needed replacements before a single beating was finished. When Augustus died in 14 AD, the frontier garrisons on the Rhine and Danube mutinied in serious disorder. Tacitus's account of those mutinies is unusually detailed, and what makes it striking is that the soldiers' grievances had almost nothing to do with battle. They were not protesting a lost campaign or a failed siege. They were protesting the accumulated weight of peacetime garrison life. Pay withheld or delivered late, service terms extended past the promised discharge date, and the unchecked brutality of men like Lucilius. Lucilius did not survive the mutiny. His own men killed him. His death was not random violence. It was the pressure of the institution, concentrated into one man and his vine staff over years of garrison service, released inward when the restraints that normally contained it failed. The mutinies were eventually suppressed. New commanders came. Promises were made and partially honored. But the events of 14 AD are as much a part of Roman military history as any famous victory. They are proof that the system, however carefully designed, was not invulnerable. The punishment hierarchy that men like Lucilius embodied and sometimes distorted was, at its design level, a graduated architecture of behavioral control. At the bottom, the vine staff itself. Immediate, personal, routine. The centurion's correction of minor failures, delivered without ceremony and forgotten by the next morning. Above that, the animadversio fustium, a formal flogging before the assembled unit, reserved for more serious offences. The public nature was deliberate. A centurion's personal correction was between him and one man. This punishment was witnessed by every soldier in the century, which was the mechanism of its effect. Above that, financial penalties, pay docked, rations reduced, compulsory additional duties assigned without compensation. For men already receiving limited net cash after all the deductions from their official salary, and we will look at those deductions in considerable detail, financial punishment struck with particular force. Above that, the barley punishment. Roman soldiers were entitled to wheat rations, the standard food of the civilized Roman world. Being issued barley instead, the food given to animals and to men who had failed the standard of a soldier, was a formal military punishment documented from the 2nd century BC onward. The humiliation was as significant as the reduced nutrition. The army was telling a man, in the most basic possible language, that he had not been a Roman soldier today. Above that, missio ignominiosa, dishonorable discharge. All accumulated benefits stripped. The discharge bonus gone. 20 years of financial investment in the institution erased. The citizenship that an auxiliary soldier had been earning through a quarter-century of service withdrawn. This was the most severe, non-lethal punishment in the Roman military system, and it was severe precisely because of what the institution had promised and what this penalty removed. At the ceiling rarely reached, historically speaking, decimation, the execution of every 10th man in a unit that had shown collective cowardice or mutiny, selected by lot and killed by his own comrades. The historical caution here is important, and the script must be honest about it. Decimation was not a regular feature of Roman military life. Confirmed uses are almost entirely from the Republican period. The general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered it against the survivors of a defeated unit during the Spartacus campaign in 71 BC. Augustus reportedly used it once, in 17 BC. After that, the evidence for actual practice becomes extremely thin. Decimation functioned as the theoretical ceiling of institutional violence, the knowledge that the system could go this far, providing a deterrent against collective breakdown. For most soldiers, it was something they had heard about rather than witnessed. The punishment hierarchy matters because it reveals the logic of Roman military discipline at a structural level. This was not the arbitrary cruelty of individual commanders who happened to be brutal. It was a designed system of behavioral management, graduated to match the severity of the violation, calibrated to produce specific and sustained compliance across 20 years of service. Not catharsis, not revenge. Predictable, maintained behavior, day after day, year after year, in an institution whose effectiveness depended on it. Discipline was the first component of what made the Roman soldier what he was. It shaped his days, maintained his readiness, and held the structure together across the long years when nothing dramatic was happening. But the army needed more than disciplined men standing in formation. It needed something to actually do with them. Every Roman soldier was issued 2 primary tools. The first, the gladius, A short iron sword, roughly 40 to 50 centimeters of blade, the definitive weapon of Roman close quarters, combat a tool for stabbing rather than slashing, designed for the press of bodies in an engaged formation. The second is less famous. The dolabra, a combined pickaxe and adze, 60 to 80 centimeters long, heavy, built for hard use on varied materials. Not a tool issued to specialists. Standard equipment for every legionary, carried alongside the gladius on every march, maintained alongside weapons and armor on every inspection morning. The man who showed up for morning duty at a Roman frontier fort was simultaneously a weapon of war and a construction worker. Both identities were genuine. Both were part of the same job description. Roman military doctrine treated the ability to build as a fundamental combat skill, not an incidental one. To construct a fortified camp at the end of a day's march, to dig defensive ditches, to raise timber palisades before dark, these were not the work of engineering specialists attached to the army. Granaries engineered to store a year's worth of grain without spoilage or vermin. The physical infrastructure of Roman imperial power was substantially the product of military labor. The most visible monument to this is Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 AD across the full width of northern Britain. Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and found the northern frontier unstable. His response was characteristically Roman in its ambition. A continuous physical barrier, 73 miles from the Solway Firth in the west to the mouth of the Tyne in the east. Not a symbolic gesture, but a genuine engineering project, a wall up to 3 meters wide and estimated at 4 to 5 meters high in its stone sections, fronted by a wide ditch to the north, accompanied by a protective earthwork called the vallum to the south. Every Roman mile along its length, a small fortified gateway, a mile castle controlled passage through. Between each pair of mile castles, 2 observation towers allowed surveillance of the ground on both sides. Full auxiliary forts, garrisoned by cavalry and infantry, were positioned at regular intervals to project force in both directions from the wall itself. Who built it? 3 Roman legions, the 2nd Augusta, the 6th Victrix, and the 20th Valeria Victrix. The regular garrison legions of Britain, not a specialized engineering corps, not civilian contractors awarded the project, not conscripted local labor. The soldiers themselves. Estimates suggest something on the order of 15,000 men participated in construction, working over roughly 6 years, with the wall reaching operational status around 128 AD. Stonemasons quarried sandstone from outcrops along the wall corridor. Other soldiers burned limestone in temporary kilns for mortar. The remains of those kilns are still identifiable in the archaeological record as platforms of burned stone and ash. Specialist cutters dressed the facing stones, others hauled, stacked, and set them. Engineers managed the alignment and the drainage. Centurions supervised section by section. The accounting mechanism was specific. Centurial stones. These are small inscribed tablets, carved with the identifying mark of a particular century, and embedded in the section of wall that century had built. They have been found across the length of Hadrian's Wall and are one of the most direct surviving records of Roman military labor. Not a general's name, not an imperial monument, a century's mark on its own work, preserved in stone. Here is our section. We built this. The same logic of accountability that governed battle performance governed stone laying. Clear hierarchy, assigned section, centurion responsible, record kept. Hadrian's Wall is the most visible example of military construction, but the scale of the underlying practice was far larger. The Roman road network extended across tens of thousands of miles of the empire. Military units built and maintained substantial portions of this infrastructure, documented in stone inscriptions from across the provinces, recording specific units assigned to specific road sections. These were not public works programs that the army happened to assist with. They were military investments, roads that allowed a legion to move faster than any responding force. Supply chains that remained reliable across terrain that would otherwise be impassable. Geographic assets whose military value was understood and designed into the network from the beginning. A unit that built the road, understood, from the inside, why it needed to be exactly as straight and as durable as Roman engineering required. When they marched on it, they marched on their own work. Aqueducts at permanent fort sites tell a similar story. Roman military doctrine on water supply was not casual. Clean water prevented the dysentery and waterborne illness that could incapacitate a garrison more thoroughly than any enemy attack. Military engineers designed and built aqueduct systems to supply frontier fort systems that, in many cases, also served the civilian communities growing up beside those forts. The investment was military and practical simultaneously. The construction rotations that filled peacetime soldiers' working days served multiple functions at once. They prevented the idleness that Roman writers explicitly identified as a military danger. Men with difficult physical work to complete and specific deliverables to account for have limited surplus energy for gambling, drinking, and the social disorder that idle young men in isolated locations reliably generate. They maintained the physical conditioning that training alone might not have provided. And they built the infrastructure that made future military operations more effective. Every road shortened the next campaign. Every fortification reduced the garrison required to hold the next frontier. The gladius and the dolabra were not in tension. They were complementary expressions of the same designed military system. Which raises the next question. The system controlled a soldier's time, occupied his body, and put his physical strength to work for the institution's benefit across decades of service. What did it give him in return? Here is something that surprises most people when they first encounter it. A Roman soldier who completed his service honorably could retire with a sum of money that, by the standards of the ancient world, was genuinely significant. The discharge bonus for a Roman legionary, the Premia Militiae, was set under Augustus at 3,000 denarii. The standard legionary pay rate established by Julius Caesar, which remained in effect through the 1st century AD, was 225 denarii per year. 3,000 denarii was approximately 12 to 13 years of gross pay, delivered at once, at the moment of discharge. Emperor Domitian, in the 80s or 90s AD, increased the annual rate to 300 denarii by adding a fourth installment, a pay rise that Suetonius records and that represents the most clearly attested single pay increase of the Principate. Later emperors adjusted pay further, including Septimius Severus in the late 2nd century, though the exact figures become harder to pin down with precision as the evidence gets thinner. What is clear is that the army's financial commitment to its soldiers grew alongside the empire's wealth, and that the discharge bonus remained the central promise underpinning the entire arrangement. The Aerarium Militare Augustus, created in 6 AD, was the mechanism that guaranteed this promise. It was not a general government fund, it was a dedicated financial institution whose sole purpose was ensuring soldiers received what they had been promised. Augustus seeded it with tens of millions of denarii of his own money, then established stable, ongoing tax revenue to fund it continuously. The system was designed to be self-sustaining and institutionally independent of any individual emperor's generosity. This matters because the discharge bonus was the engine of the entire system. Every other element, the discipline, the construction labor, the years of deferred gratification, was sustainable only as long as the end of service promised something real. A soldier who doubted the promise had far less reason to endure the 20 years that preceded it. The Roman state understood this with considerable clarity. Now here is the other side of that story. The official pay rate of 225 denarii per year, raised to 300 by Domitian, was not the amount a soldier actually received in cash. Before any coin changed hands, deductions were taken. The army fed its soldiers and charged them for the food. The ration was substantial, primarily wheat, supplemented with bacon, olive oil, and whatever local supply could add, but it was not free. Food costs were deducted from pay at source, before the soldier saw anything. The army clothed its soldiers and charged them for the clothing. Tunics, cloaks, military sandals, replacement boots, all deducted. Equipment maintenance and replacement. When armor needed repair, when a sandal sole wore through, when a shield required new facing leather, the cost came out of pay. The communal supplies of the contubernium, the 8-man tent group, were maintained through contributions from each member. The shared tent itself, the communal cookpot from which all 8 men ate, the hand mill for grinding the grain ration into flour, the pack animal that carried the group's equipment on campaign. 8 men splitting these costs reduced the individual burden but added up to a meaningful annual deduction. Burial club subscriptions were also deducted. Roman soldiers paid into a collective fund that guaranteed a proper funeral for any member of the unit who died in service. This was not optional, and it was not considered trivial. For a culture in which the form and completeness of burial carried genuine religious significance, the burial club was a serious institutional commitment. The army managed even the soldier's death. And then there were the compulsory savings, a portion of each pay installment and, critically, the full amount of any imperial donative was not handed to the soldier at all. It was deposited directly into the unit's accounts, not a bank the soldier could access, not a savings account he could draw on when funds were short, a ledger entry under his name, held by the unit, available only at discharge. The man who managed this ledger was the signifer, the century's standard bearer. In the field, the signifer carried the century's battle standard, the signum, at the front of the formation. In the fort, he managed the financial accounts of every soldier in his unit. Every pay installment in, every deduction out, every donative deposited, every balance updated, all recorded in the ledger, the signifer maintained in the Principia, the fort's headquarters building, stored in the same room as the unit's sacred objects and the shrine where the men's religious obligations were fulfilled. Financial records and sacred objects, managed by the same hand, kept behind the same door. This was not bureaucratic accident. In the Roman military understanding, a century's financial integrity and its honor were not separate matters. Both resided in the Principia. Both were the signifer's responsibility. The soldier could not access his deposited funds, not until the day he walked out of the fort with his discharge diploma. Emperor Domitian introduced a regulation limiting how much any individual soldier could accumulate in the unit accounts, capping individual deposits at 250 denarii. The reason for this cap is revealing. A provincial governor had attempted to use the accumulated savings of his garrison soldiers to fund a political revolt. The financial system, designed to build loyalty to the Roman state, had revealed itself as a potential instrument of the exact instability it was meant to prevent. The cap was damage control. After all the deductions, all the compulsory deposits, all the managed disbursements, the cash a soldier actually held in a given pay period could be quite modest. Surviving papyrus pay records, and the handful that exist must be read carefully, because they are too few to generalize from, freely suggest that some soldiers ended certain periods with very little in hand. The official pay rate told you almost nothing about the financial reality of daily garrison life. What sustained men in the system across 20 years was not current cash. It was the future, the deferred bonus, the accumulated deposits, the discharge diploma, and the rights it would confer. The Roman army had discovered, apparently through institutional instinct rather than any formal theory, that people will endure present hardship for future security, provided the future security is credibly guaranteed by an institution they trust to still exist when the time comes. This was also the logic behind the most quietly consequential social policy of the Roman military, the marriage ban. From Augustus onward, Roman soldiers below the rank of centurion were officially prohibited from contracting a legal Roman marriage during their years of service. The stated justification was straightforward. Families created logistical burdens, divided loyalties, and dependents whose welfare the state would be expected to support if the soldier died. An army unencumbered by legal family obligations was, in theory, a more controllable military instrument. The prohibition covered 20 years of a man's adult life. A soldier who enlisted at 16 or 18 would reach his legal discharge age in his late 30s or 40s. No institution in the history of human organization has successfully imposed celibacy on large numbers of young men stationed in isolated locations, and Rome did not manage it either. What actually happened is documented across the frontier provinces in tombstones, legal records, military diplomas, and the physical archaeology of the communities that grew up outside every permanent Roman fort. The Cannae were the civilian settlements that developed immediately beside legionary fortresses. Smaller forts were surrounded by a vicus, a village. But beside a major legionary base, what grew was something approaching a town: traders, craftspeople, tavern keepers, priests, doctors, and a population of women who were, in every functional sense, the wives of the men inside the walls. These women ran households. They raised children. They maintained the domestic economy that a soldier's remaining cash, after all the deductions, partially funded. When a soldier was detached to another posting, the household continued. When he returned, it resumed. Both parties understood the relationship as a real marriage. Roman law disagreed. If the soldier died, the household had no legal standing. His informal partner could not inherit his property. Their children were illegitimate in the Roman legal sense. They did not automatically receive their father's citizenship, could not inherit his assets, had no formal claim on the state for the service their father had rendered. The empire knew this was happening. It had been happening since the system was established. The response was not to enforce the ban, but to make partial accommodations over 2 centuries that acknowledged reality without quite admitting the policy had failed. The emperor, Claudius, granted soldiers certain rights normally reserved for married men, while maintaining the formal prohibition. Discharge diplomas, the bronze tablets handed to soldiers upon retirement, sometimes listed the names of informal partners and children, giving them a kind of administrative existence while stopping short of full legal recognition. The full resolution came in 197 AD, when Septimius Severus formally allowed soldiers to live in legal marriage with their wives. The families in the Cannae, who had been living this reality for generations, finally had legal recognition of what had always existed. The Cannae themselves, by that point, were in many cases substantial towns. They had grown organically beside the forts, sustained by the military economy, populated by soldiers' families, retired veterans, civilian contractors, local merchants who had followed the garrison economy wherever it established itself. Veterans who retired often did not travel far. Their families were already outside the gate. The community they had lived beside for decades was where they settled. Over generations, many of these communities became permanent Roman cities, their street plans echoing the grid of the fort that had generated them. Their founding populations composed substantially of men who had served the Roman military and the families they had built in the shadow of its walls. The civilian face of the Roman provinces was, in significant part, the face of the military's social aftermath. The marriage ban is, in some ways, the most humanly revealing detail of Roman military life. Not the famous battles, not the engineering feats, not the tactical brilliance, but this. 200 years of official policy that everyone ignored, that created genuine legal harm for real families, and that the empire maintained not because it worked, but because the institutional cost of admitting it didn't work was inconvenient. The systems that shape human lives are rarely as clean as their designers intended. Rome's were no different. If you are finding this history valuable, subscribing to the channel helps us continue covering the stories that most Roman history leaves out. There is a great deal more to explore. The army had structured a soldier's time through discipline. It had occupied his body through construction labor. It had managed his money through the pay and deduction system. It had shaped his social world through the marriage ban and the communities that grew up in response to it. What did it do with his inner life? If there is one document that captures the answer to that question with unusual specificity, it is a papyrus recovered from the ruins of a Roman military post called Dura Europos on the Euphrates River in what is now eastern Syria. The document dates to the reign of Severus Alexander, sometime in the 220s or early 230s AD. It belonged to a unit of Palmyrene soldiers, men from the city of Palmyra, serving Rome on the eastern frontier. The papyrus lists, month by month, the official religious observances required of the garrison across the year. Scholars call it the Feriale Duranum, the military festival calendar from Dura. The caution about this source is real. It is one document, from one unit, on one frontier, in the 3rd century AD. It cannot simply stand for all Roman garrisons in all periods. But what it illustrates is a structural principle consistent with other evidence from across the Roman military world. The list is longer than most people would expect. More than 40 official observances in a single year. Some honor traditional Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, the divine protectors of the Roman state. Others mark the birthdays of reigning and deified emperors, the anniversaries of imperial accessions and adoptions, the dates of significant military victories from decades or even generations past. Each observance required a specific form of ceremony: supplications, animal sacrifices, full unit parades in best equipment, communal rituals that the entire garrison performed together. For the Palmyrene soldiers at Dura, this meant performing Roman imperial religious ceremonies on the same dates that every other Roman garrison across the empire was performing them, celebrating the birthday of an emperor they might never see in person, honoring the anniversary of a military victory won before most of them were born, affirming, in public ceremony, their membership in a system that stretched from the Euphrates to the Rhine to the edge of Scotland. These soldiers spoke Aramaic at home. Archaeological evidence from Dura Europos shows Palmyrene soldiers maintaining personal dedications to their own Palmyrene gods alongside their official Roman observances. The two religious worlds coexisted, but in the parade, in the sacrifice, in the communal ceremony, they performed the same ritual as soldiers on Hadrian's Wall, doing the same thing on the same day, 6,000 miles away. This was the religious calendar's function. The Roman army had recruited from every corner of the known world, from Britain, from North Africa, from Syria, from the Danube basin, from Germany. The practical challenge of creating institutional coherence across this diversity was immense. Shared ceremony was one solution. The same dates, the same forms, the same acknowledgement of the same imperial figure, performed simultaneously across an empire whose soldiers had no other obvious common ground. Alongside the official calendar, other religious forms flourished in the spaces it left open. Mithraism spread substantially through military networks in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, particularly on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Its emphasis on grades of initiation, on brotherhood among those who had passed through the same trials, on self-discipline and controlled behavior, these were qualities that resonated with men already living inside a hierarchical institution that demanded exactly those things of them. Archaeological evidence of Mithraic shrines at or near frontier fort sites suggests the religion offered soldiers something the official calendar did not: a chosen community within the larger mandatory one. The religious life of a Roman garrison was layered, and that layering was itself a form of institutional sophistication. The official calendar provided shared identity. The personal and unit devotions provided individual meaning. Together they filled the calendar of the year with purpose and punctuation, interrupting the routine of training and construction and guard duty with moments of collective significance. The bathhouse provided the other anchor of daily communal life. Virtually every permanent Roman fort had one. The archaeological record is consistent across sites from Britain to Syria. The bathhouse was a standard installation, built as part of every permanent fortress, not an optional luxury that wealthy garrisons might add. Hot room, warm room, cold plunge. Clean water supplied through the fort's aqueduct, steam and heat, and the smell of olive oil used in place of soap. After the construction detail or the training rotation, after the duty assignment that might have included anything from escorting a supply convoy to digging out the fort's drainage channels, soldiers moved through the bathhouse. The formal hierarchy relaxed somewhat. Multiple languages mixed in the steam. Information that could not be discussed in formation traveled between men who had nothing to discuss officially and everything to discuss personally. The bathhouse was where the institution's human content was most visible. The contubernium, the 8-man tent unit, was the social foundation beneath everything else. These men shared 2 small connected rooms in the permanent barracks, a front room for storing equipment, a back room perhaps 4 by 5 meters in size, for sleeping. They ate together from a communal cookpot, their individual grain rations pooled and prepared together. They shared tools, costs, and the accumulated daily texture of years of proximity. When one man received a package from home, food, wine, the socks and sandals mentioned in the Vindolanda tablets, it was distributed among men who were, in every practical sense, each other's family in the absence of their real ones. These bonds were real. When a soldier died in service, his contubernales, his tent companions, sometimes covered financial gaps he left behind from their own resources. The 8-man unit was not just an administrative convenience. It was the human interior of the institution, the scale at which abstract military loyalty became something concrete and personal. The long years of garrison life were not, however, uniformly manageable. Roman writers understood this. Tacitus and others explicitly identified idleness as a military danger, not as a modern psychological observation, but as a practical military concern rooted in direct experience. The construction rotations, the training schedules, the religious calendar, the administrative duties, all of it served partly as a pressure management system for the social disorder that isolated young men under hierarchical control will generate if their energy is not deliberately directed. When the management failed, the results were documented. The mutinies of 14 AD on the Rhine and Danube simultaneously, in the immediate aftermath of Augustus's death, erupted not from military defeat and not from external threat. They came from the accumulated weight of peacetime garrison life. Pay withheld or delivered late, service terms extended past promised discharge dates, centurions who had been allowed to operate with too little oversight for too long. The grievances were entirely internal, entirely institutional, and entirely the product of the system's own accumulated pressures. The mutinies were suppressed, new commanders arrived, promises were partially honored. The institution resumed its operations. But the events of that year are a necessary part of any honest account of Roman military life. The design was sophisticated. The men inside it were human. Those 2 facts were not always compatible. After 20 years or 25, for an auxiliary soldier, a day came that most veterans had been calculating toward since they enlisted. Not with a parade, not with a triumph through Rome. The onesta missio, the honorable discharge, was an administrative event. The soldier's service record was reviewed. His years of service were confirmed. His conduct was assessed. If everything aligned, he received his release from the institution that had organized every hour of his adult life for 2 decades. He also received a document. The Roman military discharge diploma was a pair of bronze tablets, each roughly the size of a large writing tablet, engraved with the soldier's name, his unit, his years of service, and his new legal standing. The format was standardized, 2 copies of the same text, the sealed copy being the legally binding document and an open copy available for everyday reference. When a veteran's children needed to prove their father's service years later, when a legal claim depended on establishing someone's citizenship, the diploma was the proof. For legionaries who had been Roman citizens when they enlisted, the diploma confirmed the rights and privileges available to veterans. For auxiliary soldiers, the non-citizens recruited from across the provinces who had served 25 years in cohorts and cavalry units, the diploma did something more. It conferred Roman citizenship, a legal transformation that changed everything. The right to contract a legal marriage, the right to have children recognized as Roman citizens who could stand in Roman courts and inherit Roman property, the right to a legal identity that the previous 25 years of service had formally withheld. Some of these diplomas have survived. Not many, given the numbers that must have been issued across centuries, but enough to be held in museums and read today. The names of men who served in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, their units, the emperors who authorized their discharge, all still legible on bronze that has outlasted the forts where these men spent the longest years of their lives. With the diploma came the discharge bonus. 3,000 denarii for a legionary under the Augustan system, the sum that the aeraria militar had been holding since the day the man enlisted. The promise kept. The 12 or 13 years of gross pay delivered as a single payment after 20 years of service. It was enough to buy land, to establish a farming operation, to serve as capital for a trade in a provincial town that had a Roman road running through it and a former soldier's eye for logistics. Most veterans did not go far. The Cannae that had grown up beside every permanent frontier fort were not only the home of soldiers in formal families, they were the destination of soldiers upon discharge. The man who walked out through the fort gate with his diploma and his bonus walked most often into the community outside the walls that had been there for his entire posting. The settlement where his family had been living, where his children had grown up, where a network of former soldiers and their women and their children constituted a community that understood him without explanation. Veterans settled into local civic life with the ease of men who had spent decades inside a bureaucratic system. They knew how records were kept, how authority was exercised, how institutions maintained themselves. In provincial towns across Britain, the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, retired soldiers became the backbone of local administration, magistrates, property owners, the fathers of families who carried Roman citizenship into the next generation. The towns themselves carry this history in their bones. Many Roman settlements that began as military cannae eventually became permanent cities, their street plans preserving the ghost of the fort's grid, their founding populations composed substantially of men who served the army and the families who waited outside its walls. The civilian face of the Roman provinces was, in no small part, the army's demographic legacy. And some veterans, after a few years of attempting civilian life, walked back through the gate, not in defeat, in recognition. They re-enlisted as evocati recalled veterans, serving in a senior capacity with distinct status, because 20 years inside an institution is, for certain people, the only life that makes complete sense. The rhythm, the structure, the morning trumpet, the assigned duties. The belonging that comes from being known by a specific role inside a specific hierarchy. These are not small things. For some men, they were everything. The fort on the Rhine, where this video began. The one where the horn sounded before dawn, where soldiers moved through the grey light to roll call, where 800 men's days were accounted for before the sun was fully up, was not a famous place. No famous battle was fought there. No famous general is remembered for commanding it. No chronicle preserved its daily operations in any detail that has survived. But thousands of men spent years of their lives inside it. They trained in all weather and drilled formations they might never use. They cut stone and hauled timber and marked their work in the wall with their century's name. They endured the vine staff and the financial deductions and the legal fiction that their families did not exist. They sat in the bathhouse after long days and talked in half a dozen languages about nothing much. They wrote letters home asking for warm socks. They sent requests to their commanders for more beer. They kept the financial ledger accurate and the weapons in good repair and the formation tight year after year in service of an institution that asked everything of them and, at the end, gave back what it had promised. They were not the heroes of the famous accounts. They were the reason the famous accounts were possible. The machine did not make itself. It was built in the mornings, thousands of ordinary mornings, before the sun cleared the river, when the horn sounded and the men moved, and the long, patient, deliberate work of holding an empire together began again.